Okay, so today we're doing a deep dive into something a little different, but super interesting. Have you ever heard of the Anion Gap?
The Anion Gap.
Yeah, the Anion Gap.
Yeah, of course. I'm a doctor.
Right, of course. Sorry. But for our listeners who aren't doctors, the Anion Gap is kind of like this secret code, you know? It helps doctors figure out what's going on when someone's blood is too acidic.
Yeah, exactly. It can tell us so much about what's happening inside the body just from this one little calculation.
So today we're going to break it all down,
Yeah.
Like, what exactly is the Anion Gap? How do you even calculate it? And why does it matter so much for, like, diagnosis and treatment?
Right. It's a simple concept, but has some really big implications.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. Can you explain what the Anion Gap actually is?
Yeah.
In a way that even I can understand.
Sure. So, you know how our blood is full of all these tiny little charged particles?
Yeah, I vaguely remember that from high school chemistry.
Right. Well, those are called ions, and some of them are positively charged. Those are called ions, and some are negatively charged, and we call those anions.
Okay, so like pluses and minuses.
Exactly. Now, some of the most common ions in our blood are sodium and potassium, which are positively charged, and then chloride and bicarbonate, which are negatively charged.
Got it.
So the anion gap is basically the difference between those measured positive and negative ions in the blood.
So if we have more positive ions than negative ones, or vice versa, that could be a sign that something's off.
Exactly. That's when it becomes a clue for us. It's like a little red flag that says, hey, there might be something else going on here that we need to investigate.
Okay, that makes sense. So how do you actually calculate the Anion Gap? Is there like a formula or something?
Yeah, there is. It's pretty straightforward, actually. You take the sodium level and subtract the sum of the chloride and bicarbonate levels. So sodium minus, open parentheses, chloride plus bicarbonate, close parentheses.
Sodium minus chloride plus bicarbonate. Got it. And that gives you the Anion Gap.
Yep, that's it.
Okay, cool. So what's considered a normal Anion Gap, and when should doctors start to worry?
So a normal Anion gap is usually between 8 to 16 milliequivalents per liter, or MEQL for short. But, different labs might have slightly different reference ranges.
Oh, right.
So it's always important to take that into account. But generally speaking, if the Anion gap is higher than 16, it could indicate a problem.
Okay, so a high Anion Gap, bad news. What kind of problems can cause a high Anion Gap?
Well, a high anion gap usually means there's an excess of acids in the blood, what we call metabolic acidosis.
Acidosis.
Yeah, acidosis. It means the blood is too acidic. And this can happen for a bunch of different reasons.
Okay, like what? Give us some examples.
One example is lactic acidosis, which can happen when the body isn't getting enough oxygen. Like think about when you work out really hard and your muscles start to burn.
Oh, yeah. I know that feeling.
Yeah, that's lactic acid building up in your muscles.
Interesting. So it's not just a feeling, it's like a real thing happening in my body.
Exactly. It's a real physiological process, but it can also happen in more serious situations, like during a heart attack or a severe infection, when the body is under a lot of stress.
Wow. Okay. So that's lactic acidosis. What else?
Another common cause of high anion gap metabolic acidosis is diabetic ketoacidosis. This one's a bit more complex, but basically...
Wait, back up for a sec. What is ketoacidosis? I hear that word thrown around a lot.
Sure. So ketoacidosis, or DKA for short, is a serious complication of diabetes. It happens when the body starts running out of insulin and it can't use glucose for energy anymore.
Glucose being sugar.
Right, sugar. So without glucose, the body starts breaking down fat for fuel instead. And when that happens, it produces these byproducts called ketones.
Okay, so what's the problem with ketones?
Well, ketones are acidic. So when they build up in the blood, they can make the blood too acidic.
Gotcha. And that's where the high Anion Gap comes in.
Exactly. The ketones are negatively charged, so they contribute to that imbalance between positive and negative ions, driving the anion gap up.
Okay, that makes sense. So lactic acidosis, diabetic ketoacidosis. Those both sound pretty intense. Any other things that can cause a high Anion Gap?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Kidney failure is a big one.
Kidney failure, how so?
Well, healthy kidneys usually filter out all sorts of waste products from the blood, but when the kidneys aren't working properly, those waste products can build up, and many of those waste products are acids.
So it's kind of like the body's garbage disposal is broken and the trash is piling up.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And that buildup of acidic waste products can lead to, you guessed it, a high anion gap.
Makes sense. So high Anion Gap usually means there's some kind of acid buildup in the blood, right?
Right.
Okay, so what about the opposite? What if the anion gap is normal or even low? Does that mean everything's okay?
Not necessarily. There's another type of metabolic acidosis called normal anion gap metabolic acidosis or hyperchloremic metabolic acidosis.
Okay, you're going to have to break that one down for me.
Sure, sure. So instead of an excess of unmeasured acids, like in high anion gap metabolic acidosis, this type is usually caused by either a loss of bicarbonate or an increase in chloride.
Bicarbonate, that's one of those ions we were talking about before, right?
Exactly. It's one of the main negatively charged ions in our blood, and it plays a big role in maintaining that acid-base balance.
So if we lose bicarbonate, our blood becomes more acidic.
Exactly. And that can happen for a few reasons, like severe diarrhea, for example.
Diarrhea. How does that cause us to lose bicarbonate?
Well, when you have diarrhea, your body loses a lot of fluids and electrolytes, and bicarbonate is one of those electrolytes.
Oh, I see. So it's not just about the acids building up, it's also about losing the things that help balance those acids out?
Exactly. It's all about maintaining that delicate balance.
Got it. Are there any other causes of this normal anion gap acidosis?
Yeah, there are a few. One is renal tubular acidosis, which is a problem with the kidney's ability to reabsorb bicarbonate.
So the bicarbonate just gets flushed out in the urine.
Yep, pretty much. And another cause is something called dilutional acidosis, which can happen when people are given large amounts of intravenous fluids that contain chloride.
Okay, so a lot of different things can cause both high anion gap and normal anion gap acidosis, huh?
Yep.
So why is all this so important? Like, why should we as patients even care about the anion gap?
Well, the Anion Gap is a really important tool for doctors because it helps them narrow down the possible causes of metabolic acidosis and figure out the best way to treat it.
So it's like a clue that helps them solve the mystery of why someone's blood is too acidic.
Exactly.
And the treatment for a high anion gap acidosis is going to be different for the treatment for a normal anion gap acidosis.
Right, because the underlying causes are different. For example, if someone has lactic acidosis from sepsis, the focus is going to be on treating the infection. But if someone has normal anion gap acidosis from diarrhea, the treatment might involve replacing the lost fluids and electrolytes.
Okay, so it's not a one-size-fits-all situation.
Nope, not at all.
Wow, this is all so fascinating. So the anion gap is this simple calculation, but it can tell us so much about what's happening in the body.
Absolutely, it's a powerful tool.
I'm curious, though, do you think the anion gap could have other uses beyond just diagnosing acidosis? Like, could it be used to monitor other health conditions or even predict future health problems?
That's a really interesting question, and honestly, I don't have a definitive answer for you, but it's definitely possible that as we learn more about the anion gap and its role in various metabolic processes, we might find other ways to use it. It's definitely something worth exploring further.
Yeah, it seems like there's a lot more to uncover. Well, thanks for diving deep into the anion gap with us today. I know I learned a lot.
My pleasure. It's always fun to talk about this stuff.
And to our listeners, we hope you enjoyed this deep dive as well. Be sure to check back next week for another episode of, well, whatever we decide to deep dive into next. You never know what you might learn.
You've been listening to the Learning Podcast, a production of metaNESTA. Remember, learning is a journey. One step, one insight, one skill at a time. We'll see you next time. Keep learning, stay curious, and as always, be awesome.